While I was having surgery, my son tore my life apart. He sold my farm, the land I had worked on for decades, burned the crippled cat I had carried and cared for through 6 long years, and left for a honeymoon with his wife. When I returned home, my house gone, and the one living creature that loved me turned to ash. Then he came back, laughed, and said that my farm had paid for his wife's trip to the Bahamas. I laughed and asked what he thought was so funny, because his laughter wouldn't last. Before we dive in, please consider giving us a thumbs up. The taxi driver kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror as we drove down the familiar county road. 3 weeks in the hospital had left me looking like death warmed over. The surgical scar across my chest still throbbed with each heartbeat, pulling tight with every breath like someone had sewn piano wire under my skin. The afternoon sun blazed through the windshield, making my eyes water. Or maybe that was just the morphine wearing off. I'd insisted on coming home alone despite the doctor's protests. No one had visited me during recovery anyway. Not my son Garrett, not his wife Marlena. The nurses had stopped asking about family after the first week, their pitying looks harder to bear than the physical pain. The driver slowed down where my farm's entrance should have been, where the wooden gate with our family name had stood for 40 years, weathered by countless storms but never falling. There was nothing but a chain-link fence with a bright yellow "Sold" sticker slapped across a real estate sign. My stomach turned, bile rising despite the anti-nausea medication. 20 acres of corn and soybeans that I'd planted every spring since 1978. The red barn my father had built with his own hands after returning from Korea. The 2-story farmhouse where Garrett had taken his first steps on creaking floorboards that sang different notes depending on where you stepped. All of it was supposed to be there, waiting like an old friend. Instead, I was looking at bare dirt scarred with excavator tracks, the earth raw and wounded under the harsh spring sun. I paid the driver with shaking hands, the bills damp with sweat from my palm, walking through where my front door used to felt like stepping into a grave. The foundation was still there, cracked concrete outlining rooms that no longer existed, like chalk marks at a crime scene. The kitchen where Helen had made Sunday dinners, the smell of her pot roast drawing Garrett down from his room even during his sullen teenage years. The living room where we'd put up Christmas trees, Helen insisting on real ones despite my complaints about the needles. Garrett's childhood bedroom where I'd read him stories, back when he still wanted me around. All reduced to geometric shapes in weathered concrete, filled with muddy water from last night's rain. But it was the small, burnt patch near what used to be the tool shed that made my knees buckle, sending me down hard onto the wet ground. Black, scorched earth in a rough circle, maybe 3 feet across, the soil still dead after 3 weeks. That's where Patches's shelter had been, the converted doghouse I'd insulated myself, lined with old blankets that Helen had saved. The burnt smell hadn't completely faded, mixing with spring soil and diesel fumes to create something that made me gag. I touched the dead earth with trembling fingers, feeling the greasy texture of ash mixed with rain. Patches had been hit by a mower 6 years ago on a foggy morning, the accident mangling her left hind leg beyond saving. The vet, a young woman fresh from school, had suggested euthanasia, calling it the humane choice. But Patches had looked at me with those green eyes, still purring despite the pain, her rough tongue licking my hand as if to say she wasn't ready to go. She'd learned to walk again over months of patient work, developing a hopping gait that made visitors smile. She'd been the only living thing that seemed to notice when I'd had my first heart episode 2 years ago, pawing at my chest and yowling until I'd called the ambulance. My neighbor's voice came from behind me before I heard footsteps on the gravel. The woman who lived across the road, 61 years old, and built like someone who'd spent 30 years wrestling patients in the emergency room, stood at the property line. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, the kind that comes from witnessing something that changes how you see the world. She told me she'd tried to stop it, had even called the sheriff when she saw the smoke that morning. But Garrett had power of attorney while I was incapacitated, all the paperwork in perfect order with proper notarization. She'd watched him pour the gasoline himself, methodical and calm, making sure to soak the wooden structure thoroughly. The screaming had lasted maybe 30 seconds, she said, her voice breaking. But she still heard it at night when everything else was quiet. 2 days after the burning, while I was still unconscious from surgery complications that shouldn't have happened, Garrett had signed the sales papers. $200,000 for 20 acres of prime farmland, the house, the barn, everything. Below market value by at least 30%. But the buyers paid cash, and Garrett had debts I didn't know about until later. The investment group from the city planning to build storage units had started demolition the day the check cleared, bringing in crews who worked through the night. By the time I'd woken up in the ICU, tubes down my throat and machines breathing for me, my entire life had been reduced to a direct deposit in an account I couldn't access and a dead cat I'd never get to bury. The sound of Garrett's BMW pulling up the dirt road made my neighbor retreat to her property, her shoulders hunched like she was walking against a strong wind. He'd always made people uncomfortable, even as a child. Something cold in his eyes that made other parents keep their children away. Marlena sat in the passenger seat, her fresh tan from the Bahamas visible even through the tinted windshield, her hand moving to her stomach in that unconscious protective gesture I'd seen before. They'd been gone for 2 weeks, according to my neighbor, first-class flights and 5-star resorts, living large while I was learning to walk again, after having my chest cracked open like a lobster. Garrett stepped out first, designer sunglasses hiding his eyes, wearing a linen shirt that probably cost more than most people's mortgage payment. His shoes, Italian leather that would be ruined by the mud, squelched as he walked closer. Marlena followed slowly, avoiding eye contact, her body language screaming discomfort like a frequency only I could hear. She wore a sundress that showed her tan lines, but her face was pale beneath the bronzed skin, makeup not quite hiding the dark circles under her eyes. "Dad," Garrett said, not even pretending surprise at seeing me here. "You look terrible. Shouldn't you still be in rehabilitation?" He was smiling, actually smiling as he surveyed the empty land where his childhood had unfolded. The spot where we'd built a treehouse together when he was 7, where Helen had planted her vegetable garden, where Patches had spent sunny afternoons stalking grasshoppers. All of it erased like it had never existed, like our life here had been nothing more than a pencil sketch easily rubbed out. "Thanks to your farm, my wife will get to know the Bahamas," he said, that smile widening to show teeth too white to be natural. 20 years you held on to this place like it was gold. Turns out it was. Just took someone with vision to cash it in." I looked at him, this stranger wearing my son's face, and felt something cold settle in my chest where the surgical pain had been burning. "What's so funny?" I asked, my voice rough from the ventilator tube. "You're old, sick, and now have nothing. That's what's funny." I bent down slowly, my incision pulling tight enough to make spots dance in my vision, and scooped up a handful of the blackened earth where Patches had died. The ash mixed with soil felt gritty between my fingers, still smelling faintly of gasoline and something worse, something organic and final. I let it sift through my fingers, watching it fall back to the dead ground like black snow. Marlena shifted nervously by the car, her hand still protecting her stomach, and I saw her wince when the wind carried the burnt smell toward them. "Everything has a price, son," I said, standing with effort that made my vision gray at the edges. "Even betrayal." The wind picked up, swirling the disturbed ash around our feet, and Garrett's laugh sounded forced, hollow as a dead tree. He didn't know about the documents his mother had hidden years ago. He didn't know about his daughter from his first marriage, who'd been calling the hospital. Most importantly, he didn't know about the family medical history that would change everything. Secrets written in genetic code that couldn't be erased like a farm or burned like a cat. I turned my back on him and started walking toward my neighbor's property line, each step sending fire through my chest. Behind me, I heard Marlena whisper something urgent to Garrett, her voice carrying fear sharp enough to cut. She was smarter than him, could sense that something had shifted in the air like pressure before a storm. "Where are you going?" Garrett called after me, and for the first time I heard uncertainty crack his voice. I didn't answer. I just kept walking, carrying the smell of scorched earth with me, already planning the call I'd make once I reached my neighbor's house. In my clenched fist, hidden from their view, ash and soil fell through my fingers like sand through an hourglass, marking time until everything Garrett had built on the bones of my life came crashing down. The motel reeked of old smoke and regret, wallpaper peeling like burned skin. I sat on the squeaking bed, sorting through a box my brother rescued from the farm before demolition. At 72, still steady despite arthritis, he'd bribed the crew to let him take what he called family papers. Inside were my late wife Helen's prescription bottles, an archive of her decline, and a sealed envelope in her hand. The will shocked me. Jewelry left to someone named only C, and amendments to our property deed that meant my son Garrett's recent sale of the farm might not hold up. He'd pocketed $200,000, but part of it may never have been his. Garrett's calls kept buzzing, his voice no longer confident but cornered, pressing me about facilities for my care. My brother then revealed my granddaughter had sought me out at the hospital. 3 years since I'd last seen her, before divorce tore her world apart. The next document chilled me, a decades-old genetic test. Helen had known our family carried something dangerous, a hidden inheritance of illness, yet kept it secret. I thought of Marlena's hand on her stomach and felt dread. My brother showed me a text. A pharmacy clerk confirmed Garrett had been digging for information months ago, paying cash. The small town never forgets. I finally called my granddaughter. She wept, telling me Garrett had lied that I was dead. She wanted to meet, to reveal what happened when her mother left, and she knew where Garrett hid his true financial records. The motel walls closed in. My brother asked no questions. Men like him understood. I told him I needed a lawyer versed in trusts and inheritance, not farm sales. As he made calls, I opened the last item, a photo of my granddaughter at 3, Patches the cat in her lap, Garrett already glued to his phone. The roots of rot had been there all along. Then a final text arrived. "Mr. Vernon, we need to talk about your son's wife. This is Dr. Morrison's wife." The rain outside had turned into a storm, wind driving water against the window like fists pounding to get in. Lightning illuminated the room in snapshot moments, revealing the box of documents that would destroy my son's carefully constructed life. "Everything has a price," I'd told Garrett. He had no idea how high the interest had climbed while he was spending my farm in the Bahamas, how many people were waiting to collect on debts he didn't know he owed. The coffee shop downtown was one of those modern places that tried too hard to look authentic. Exposed brick and Edison bulbs, creating an atmosphere of manufactured nostalgia. The smell of overpriced espresso mixed with the perfume of college students who treated coffee like a personality trait. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall and clear sight lines to both exits, a habit that spoke of learned caution. She looked older than 19, her grandmother's sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes aged by experience that came too early. When she saw me, something broke in her carefully composed face, and for a moment she was just a kid who'd lost too much too fast. She stood when I approached, hesitating before wrapping her arms around me in a careful hug that avoided my chest where the incision still pulled with every movement. She smelled like vanilla shampoo, and the kind of subtle perfume that suggested sophistication beyond her years. Nothing like the aggressive fragrances Marlena wore to mark her territory. We sat across from each other, the table between us feeling like both a bridge over troubled water and a barricade against past pain. She'd ordered me black coffee, remembering from Sunday dinners years ago, back when we still pretended to be a family. The first thing she said wasn't what I expected. She pulled out her phone, the screen cracked but functional, and showed me a video that made my blood turn to ice water. The timestamp read 3 weeks ago, 4:17 in the morning, when most of the world was asleep, and evil felt safe to work. The quality was grainy but clear enough to recognize the farm's old tool shed, and a figure in a dark jacket methodically pouring something from a red gas can. The figure lit a match, and even in the poor light, Garrett's face was visible for just a second as the flames caught, illuminated by the fire he'd started. Then came screaming that made me close my eyes, high and terrible, an animal in agony that didn't understand why the world had turned to flame. She'd been there that night, she explained, her voice steady, but her hands shaking around her coffee cup. She'd been sleeping in her car at the end of the drive, wanting to see me before the surgery but unable to face the house where so many bad memories lived. She'd been filming because she'd heard Patches crying earlier, thinking maybe she could document neglect, never imagining she'd witness murder. She'd tried to run toward the shed when she realized what was happening, but Garrett had grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises that took weeks to fade. He'd told her that if she said anything, he'd make sure she never saw another cent of family money, not knowing she had her own inheritance coming that he couldn't touch. What she told me next changed everything I thought I knew about my son's capacity for cruelty. 3 years ago, just before her parents' divorce became final, she'd found her mother unconscious in the garage with the car running. Her mother had insisted later it was an accident, that she'd fallen asleep listening to music, just a misunderstanding that could happen to anyone. But my granddaughter had checked the car's computer system later, something her father didn't know she could do. The engine had been running for exactly 45 minutes, the radio had never been turned on, and the garage door had been locked from the outside with the only key Garrett had insisted on keeping. Her mother had left the next week, too broken to fight for custody, too scared to prove what couldn't be proven without reasonable doubt. Garrett had painted her as unstable in court, used her suicide attempt as evidence she was an unfit mother. The judge had believed him because Garrett was good at playing the concerned husband, the protective father who only wanted what was best for his daughter. He'd learned from watching me all those years how to look caring while calculating angles like a pool player planning 3 shots ahead. I told her about the medical reports I'd found, watching her face carefully as I explained what they might mean for our family's future. Her hand went to her throat in an unconscious gesture of self-protection, but she didn't look surprised. She'd suspected something was wrong with the family genetics ever since she'd started researching her grandmother's death, going down internet rabbit holes that led to medical journals and support groups. She'd even gotten tested privately 6 months ago, paying cash at a clinic 2 towns over where no one knew her name. The results had come back, she said, her voice steady as a newsreader's. She wanted to know what I knew before she shared what she'd learned. The conversation shifted to Garrett's finances, and she pulled out a flash drive small enough to swallow, the kind that could destroy lives despite its size. She'd been copying files for 2 years, she said, every time she visited, and Garrett left his laptop open while he took his important calls. Tax returns that didn't match bank statements, the numbers off by amounts that couldn't be explained by rounding errors, offshore accounts in places that sounded like vacation destinations, but were really financial black holes. A shell company that existed only on paper and in pixels, moving money like a 3-card Monte dealer. Nearly $800,000 hidden from the IRS over 7 years, enough to buy 4 farms like mine. We were so focused on the papers spreading across the table like evidence of a crime, which they were, that neither of us noticed Marlena until she was standing beside our booth. She looked different from yesterday, her Bahamas tan already fading to something sickly, like fruit starting to rot from the inside. Her designer clothes hung loose as if she'd lost weight overnight. Or maybe it was just that the confidence that filled them had evaporated. She slid into the booth beside my granddaughter, who tensed but didn't move away, recognizing another victim when she saw one. "I know what you're doing," Marlena said, her voice hoarse like she'd been screaming or crying or both. "And I want to help." The coffee shop noise faded to white static as Marlena told her story. Each word another nail in the coffin of her marriage. The pregnancy wasn't Garrett's, she admitted, her hand moving protectively to her stomach. She'd been having an affair for 6 months with someone who'd been kind when Garrett was cruel, gentle when Garrett was rough. The affair had started after Garrett had become increasingly violent at home. Not hitting yet, but throwing things, punching walls, grabbing her wrist just hard enough to leave marks that looked like bracelets of bruises. The other man was married too, with children and a reputation to protect. And when Marlena had told him about the pregnancy, he'd chosen his family over his mistress. The man's wife had called Marlena an hour ago, very calm and very cold, like a surgeon explaining how the amputation would proceed. She would be filing for alienation of affection, a lawsuit that still existed in our state like a relic from another century. She would be subpoenaing phone records, credit card statements, hotel receipts with timestamps that told their own story. She would make sure everyone in town knew exactly what kind of woman Marlena was, unless Marlena wanted to make a deal. Help expose Garrett's financial crimes in exchange for silence about the affair. It seemed the wife had her own reasons for wanting Garrett destroyed. Something about a business deal that had gone wrong years ago. My granddaughter reached across the table and touched my hand, her fingers cold from holding her iced coffee. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "there's something else about Dad you need to know." She pulled up another video on her phone, this one from 2 months ago, showing Garrett in what looked like a medical office. The audio was muffled but clear enough to hear him asking questions about power of attorney, about how long someone could be kept sedated after surgery, about what would happen if an elderly patient developed complications. The person off camera was explaining mortality rates and risk factors, and Garrett's response was clear as day. "What can we do to improve those odds?" The video ended, and the three of us sat in silence heavy enough to bend light. Marlena was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper that cut through the coffee shop noise like a razor. "He took out a life insurance policy on you 6 months ago, $3 million. He's the sole beneficiary." I thought about my surgery, about the complications that had kept me under for 3 extra days, while my son spent my farm money in the Bahamas. I thought about the infection that had appeared from nowhere, despite prophylactic antibiotics, spreading through my system like Garrett's greed. Everything clicked into place with the horrible clarity of a diagnosis finally made. Garrett hadn't just wanted my farm, he'd wanted me dead, erased completely, not even a memory to stand in his way. My granddaughter squeezed my hand tighter, and I realized I was shaking. Not from fear or medication side effects, but from rage so pure it felt like electricity in my veins, like lightning looking for ground. My son had tried to murder me, had murdered Patches, had tried to kill his first wife, and now he was out there, probably sitting in his expensive house bought with borrowed money, planning his next move while the baby that wasn't his grew in his wife's belly. "We're going to destroy him," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, like discussing the weather. "Completely, publicly, permanently." Marlena nodded, her hand moving to her stomach again. "The baby's not his, but he doesn't know that yet. He's already telling everyone, planning a gender reveal party next month, invited half the town." My granddaughter smiled then, and it was Helen's smile, sharp and knowing, the expression of someone who'd already won, but was letting the other player finish their move. Then that's when we do it, in front of everyone he wants to impress. We spent the next hour planning. 3 generations of the wronged united by shared hatred of someone who should have been loved. The coffee grew cold as we mapped out the destruction of Garrett Vernon. Each detail another cut in the death by 1,000 cuts we were preparing. By the time we left, separately to avoid suspicion, the path forward was clear, as the psychiatric medication Garrett would probably need when this was over. That night, back in my $15 motel room with its water-stained ceiling and broken dreams, I opened Helen's old journal that my brother had found in the box. Her handwriting, shaky from the disease but still legible, spelled out the truth she'd never told me. She'd known about Garrett's nature long before the disease had given her clarity through paranoia. She'd seen the cruelty growing in him like a tumor, fed by something in his DNA that twisted love into possession and family into opportunity. She'd protected what she could, hidden what she could, and died believing she'd failed everyone. The USB drive my granddaughter had given me glowed red when I plugged it into my laptop, like a drop of blood in the dark room. Everything has a price, and Garrett's payment was coming due with interest compounded daily since the day he'd decided his father's life was worth less than a beach vacation. 3 weeks had passed since the coffee shop meeting, and the motel room had become mission control for a war Garrett didn't know was being fought. The walls were covered with papers and timelines, financial records and medical documents, creating a mosaic of evidence that told the story of a son's betrayal. My brother had moved into the room next door, said he wanted to keep an eye on me, but really he understood that some battles required witnesses. He never asked questions, just brought food, and made sure I took my medications on time, the pills that kept my damaged heart beating toward revenge. The gender reveal party was set for Saturday afternoon, 3 days away, at the country club Garrett had spent years trying to join. Marlena had sent me screenshots of the invitation he'd designed, all pastels and professional photography from their Bahamas trip. Every pixel screaming success. 150 guests invited, the kind of people Garrett needed to impress, the social circle he'd cultivated like a garden of useful connections. He'd even hired a party planner, spending $12,000 he didn't have on what he called a memorable experience. It would be memorable, just not in the way he'd planned. The doctor who'd performed my surgery had agreed to cooperate after his wife threatened to report him to the medical board. He'd broken down completely in a meeting at a truck stop diner, admitted that Garrett had paid him $50,000 in cash to ensure complications, though he swore he'd never intended for things to go as far as they did. He'd just prolonged the sedation, created a minor infection that would extend recovery time, give Garrett more time with power of attorney. But the infection had turned serious, nearly septic, and he'd spent 3 days fighting to save my life from the very thing he'd caused. The guilt was eating him alive, he said, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold his coffee cup. The IRS agent my brother had contacted through his veteran network was a young woman who'd been looking for a case like this to make her career. $800,000 in tax fraud was enough to get federal attention, especially with the offshore accounts, and shell companies scattered like breadcrumbs through the Caymans. She'd frozen Garrett's assets yesterday, though he didn't know it yet. He'd find out Monday morning when he tried to make payroll for his company. But by then, it would be too late. She'd also discovered something we hadn't known. Garrett had been stealing from his own business partners, skimming from joint accounts like a dealer palming cards. My granddaughter had been busy with her own preparations, using her generation's understanding of social media like a weapon. She'd contacted every person Garrett had wronged over the years, and the list was longer than a small-town phone book. His first wife's sister, who'd never believed the suicide attempt story. Former employees he'd fired and blacklisted for questioning his methods. A contractor he'd refused to pay after claiming substandard work on a project that had actually been perfect. They all had stories, all had evidence, and all wanted to see Garrett burn like he'd burned patches. She'd created a website, password protected for now, ready to go live with one click. Marlena's role was the cruelest and most necessary. She had to keep pretending everything was normal, had to let Garrett believe he was still in control while we prepared to pull the rug out from under his entire life. She told me he'd been getting more aggressive as the party approached, obsessing over every detail, like a general planning a campaign. He'd grabbed her arm twice this week hard enough to leave bruises, which she'd carefully photographed and sent to our growing evidence file. The pregnancy was making her sick, morning sickness that lasted all day. But Garrett didn't care. He just wanted her to look perfect for the party. Had even bought her a $3,000 dress she'd have to pretend to love. The night before the party, I met with the doctor's wife at a diner outside town, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the questions were few. She was exactly what I'd expected, polished on the outside but full of controlled fury, like a pressure cooker about to blow. She'd known about her husband's affairs for years, she said, but had stayed for the children. Marlena was just the latest in a long line of mistakes her husband had made. But what really interested her was Garrett's connection to her family's business. Her father owned the largest construction company in the state, and Garrett had been trying to partner with them for years. She slid a USB drive across the table, red like the one my granddaughter had given me, like drops of blood connecting all of Garrett's victims. It contained audio files of Garrett discussing illegal business practices, how to launder money through construction projects, how to destroy competitors through sabotage. He'd been recording his own crimes, keeping the files as insurance against his partners, not knowing that her father had been recording too. Mutually assured destruction, except Garrett didn't know the missiles were already in the air. The morning of the party, I stood in front of the cracked motel mirror, adjusting the tie my brother had bought me at a thrift store. I looked like death warmed over, which was fitting since my son had tried to kill me. The surgical scar was still red and angry, visible above my collar like an accusation. My hands shook slightly, not from nerves, but from the medication I'd been taking since the surgery. Beta blockers and blood thinners and pain medication I'd been weaning myself off because I needed to be sharp today. My brother drove us to the country club in his old pickup truck, which looked out of place among the luxury cars in the parking lot, like a wolf among poodles. The building was decorated like something from a magazine, pink and blue balloons arranged in elaborate arches that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Fresh flowers on every surface, their perfume unable to mask the smell of desperation and debt that followed Garrett like cologne. A professional photographer captured arriving guests, not knowing she was documenting the beginning of the end. Garrett stood at the entrance in a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, greeting everyone with that practiced smile that never reached his eyes. When he saw me, the smile flickered for just a moment, like a light bulb about to burn out. He recovered quickly, the mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Dad," he said loud enough for others to hear, playing the part of the devoted son. "I'm so glad you could make it. How are you feeling?" The concern in his voice was perfect, Oscar-worthy, the performance of a loving son worried about his father's health. Several guests smiled approvingly, probably thinking how wonderful it was that Garrett had invited me despite our differences about the farm. They didn't know he'd burned my cat alive, stolen my home, and tried to murder me for insurance money. They saw what he wanted them to see, the successful businessman with the beautiful wife and the baby on the way. The main event was scheduled for 2 o'clock, when a small plane would fly over and release either pink or blue smoke to reveal the baby's gender. Garrett had paid $5,000 for this moment, wanting something no one would forget. Inside, the party was in full swing, champagne flowing despite it being barely noon, guests mingling and congratulating Garrett and Marlena on their upcoming addition. Marlena played her part perfectly, glowing in her expensive dress, one hand protectively on her stomach, the other holding a glass of sparkling cider she pretended to sip. My granddaughter arrived 30 minutes before the reveal, wearing a simple black dress that made her look older, more serious, like an avenging angel dressed for a funeral. She'd brought a laptop, told Garrett she wanted to share some family photos during the celebration, memories of Grandma that would make the moment more special. He'd actually teared up at the suggestion, the performance so convincing that for a moment I wondered if somewhere deep inside, buried under the greed and cruelty, there was still a piece of my son left. But then I saw him check his phone, saw the satisfied smile when he read something, and I knew he was texting his lawyer about having me declared incompetent. At 1:45, the doctor's wife walked in with her father, the construction mogul Garrett had been trying to impress for years. Garrett's face went through a series of expressions like a slot machine spinning. Confusion, recognition, excitement. He practically ran over to greet them, not noticing the federal marshal who'd entered behind them, or the IRS agent dressed like a guest, but wearing a wire. The trap was set, all the players in position, waiting for 2 o'clock, when everything would come crashing down, like a house of cards in a hurricane. I found myself standing next to the window, looking out at the golf course where the plane would appear. The smell of burnt earth seemed to follow me everywhere now, a phantom scent that reminded me of patches and everything else Garrett had destroyed. In 15 minutes, his world would end as thoroughly as mine had. The difference was that I'd had no warning, no chance to prepare. He would have to watch it happen in real time, in front of everyone who mattered to him, with no way to stop it and nowhere to run. Marlena appeared beside me, her face pale under the makeup that couldn't hide the truth. "He knows," she whispered, the words hitting like ice water, "about the baby not being his. The doctor confessed everything last night." My blood went cold. But before I could respond, Garrett's voice boomed over the sound system, commanding attention like a dictator addressing his subjects. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. Before we reveal our baby's gender, I have a special announcement to make." He was standing on the small stage they'd set up, microphone in hand like a weapon, that practiced smile now showing too many teeth. Behind him, my granddaughter sat at her laptop, her fingers poised over the keyboard. The website was ready, one click away from going live. The federal marshal had moved closer to the stage. The doctor's wife's father was recording on his phone, and the IRS agent had her hand on the arrest warrant in her purse. "You see," Garrett continued, his eyes finding mine across the room, "this isn't just about a new baby. It's about new beginnings. And sometimes, to begin fresh, you have to clear away the dead wood." The crowd murmured appreciatively, not understanding the threat in his words, the promise of destruction. But I did. This was Garrett's countermove, whatever he'd been planning while we'd been planning our revenge. The smile on his face wasn't nervous or fake anymore. It was triumphant, the expression of someone who thought he'd already won. The clock on the wall showed 1:58. 2 minutes until the plane. 2 minutes until the reveal. 2 minutes until either Garrett's destruction or mine. Everything has a price, and the bill was about to come due with penalty fees that would last a lifetime. Garrett held the microphone with white knuckles, his grip so tight I could see the tendons in his hand standing out like cables under strain. The countdown timer behind him showed 90 seconds, pink and blue numbers flashing like a heartbeat on a monitor. But his eyes were locked on mine across the room, and in them I saw the same cold calculation I'd been blind to for so many years. He knew about our plan, or at least suspected something. The question was how much he knew and what he intended to do about it. The room felt smaller suddenly, the exits blocked by bodies in expensive clothes who had no idea they were about to witness a family destroy itself in real time. "Before my wife and I share our joy," Garrett continued, his voice carrying that false warmth he'd perfected like a magician's misdirection. "I need to address something painful. Family matters that have been weighing on our hearts." Marlena's hand found my arm, her nails digging in through my jacket hard enough to leave marks. She was trembling. Whether from morning sickness or fear, I couldn't tell. But her perfume, mixed with the smell of fear sweat, created something that made my stomach turn. Across the room, my granddaughter had stopped typing, her hands frozen over the laptop keyboard like a pianist who'd forgotten the next note. The website was still ready, one click from exposing everything. But something in Garrett's tone had made her pause. Even the IRS agent had stopped moving, her hand still on the warrant but not pulling it out, everyone waiting to see what card Garrett would play. Garrett pressed a button on his phone, and the large screen behind him came to life with security footage that made my heart sink. It showed the coffee shop where my granddaughter, Marlena, and I had met 3 weeks ago. The camera angle perfect to capture us huddled together like conspirators, which we were. Papers spread across the table, heads bent close together, obviously planning something that required secrecy. The timestamp was visible, proving this wasn't fabricated, though how he'd gotten it was a question for later. The crowd murmured, confused but intrigued, thinking this was part of some elaborate reveal. They had no idea they were watching evidence of a conspiracy, though they'd soon learn which side deserved their sympathy. "My father," Garrett said, gesturing toward me with false sadness that would have fooled anyone who didn't know him, "has been struggling since his surgery. The combination of medications, the trauma of the operation, and his advanced age have led to some unfortunate delusions." The words hit like physical blows, each one calculated to destroy my credibility before I could speak. The crowd was looking at me now with pity, the kind reserved for elderly people who'd lost their grip on reality, whose minds had betrayed them before their bodies gave out. A few of them whispered to each other, probably remembering their own parents' decline, projecting their fears onto me. Garrett was painting me as senile, confused, a bitter old man lashing out at the son who'd only tried to help. It was brilliant in its simplicity, using my age and recent surgery as weapons against me. "He believes I killed his cat," Garrett continued, shaking his head with practiced sorrow. "Poor Patches died of natural causes while Dad was in the hospital. She was ancient, nearly 20 years old, and the vet confirmed she passed peacefully in her sleep. The lie was so smooth I almost believed it myself for a second, the way you might believe a dream while you're still in it. But then I remembered the video my granddaughter had, Garrett pouring gasoline with methodical precision, the screaming that lasted 30 seconds but felt like 30 years. The vet, he mentioned, was probably his golf buddy who'd lie about anything for the right price or the right connections. I started to move toward the stage, but my brother caught my arm, shook his head slightly. "Not yet," his eyes said. "Let him hang himself with his own rope." The timer showed 60 seconds, the plane getting closer, and Garrett was still talking, still weaving his web of lies. "The farm had to be sold to pay for his medical bills," Garrett explained, his voice catching with practiced emotion that would have won him an Emmy. 3 surgeries, the extended ICU stay, the infection that nearly killed him. Insurance only covered so much. I did what I had to do to save my father's life, and now he hates me for it. Another lie wrapped in enough truth to be believable, like poison hidden in honey. There had been 3 surgeries, but only because the doctor had caused complications that required additional operations, each one a chance for me to die on the table. The insurance had actually covered 90%, something the crowd wouldn't know. The farm sale money had gone straight to Garrett's accounts, not a penny toward medical bills that were already paid. But the sympathy in the room was shifting toward him, the successful son burdened with a sick, ungrateful father. Several people were recording on their phones now, thinking they were capturing a touching family moment. Marlena stepped forward then, moving toward the stage with the careful walk of a pregnant woman navigating uncertain ground. Garrett smiled, thinking she was coming to support him, to play the loving wife standing by her husband through family drama. The crowd parted for her like she was royalty, some women touching her arm gently as she passed, offering silent support for what they assumed was a difficult situation. She climbed the 3 steps to the stage slowly, one hand on her stomach, the other reaching for Garrett. He handed her the microphone without hesitation, confident in her loyalty, not knowing she'd already burned that bridge and salted the earth. "My husband," Marlena said, her voice clear and steady as a news anchor delivering breaking news, "is absolutely right about one thing. This is about family matters that have been weighing on our hearts." She turned to face the crowd, and I saw Garrett's smile flicker like a candle in the wind. Something in her tone, the way she'd emphasized certain words, had triggered his instincts for danger. But it was too late to take the microphone back without looking controlling, abusive, everything he pretended not to be. He had to stand there, trapped by his own staging, while his wife held the power. The timer showed 30 seconds, the distant sound of a plane engine becoming audible through the windows. Everything was about to converge, all our plans and his, colliding at the exact moment he'd chosen for his triumph. 3 months ago, Marlena continued, each word clear as a bell toll, I discovered I was pregnant, but not with my husband's child. The room went silent except for the growing sound of the plane. Garrett's face went through transformations like time-lapse, photography of decay. Confused to furious to disbelieving in the span of 3 heartbeats. He reached for the microphone, but Marlena stepped away, keeping it just out of reach like keeping a weapon from someone dangerous. The crowd was frozen, not sure if this was real or some elaborate performance art. The timer hit 15 seconds, and through the window, I could see the small plane approaching, ready to release its colored smoke, ready to reveal the gender of a baby that would never call Garrett father. "The father is Dr. Morrison," Marlena announced, each word a nail in Garrett's coffin, which was fitting since he'd tried to put me in mine. "The same Dr. Morrison who my husband paid $50,000 to murder his father during surgery." The gasps from the crowd were drowned out by the plane passing overhead. Pink smoke began to spread across the sky like spilled paint, revealing the baby was a girl. But no one was looking anymore. All eyes were on Garrett, whose face had gone from red to white to a gray that suggested his heart might be giving him the attack he'd tried to arrange for me. He lunged for Marlena, but the federal marshal was already moving, badge out, hand on his weapon. The IRS agent was pulling out the warrant, and the construction mogul's father was still recording, capturing every second of Garrett's destruction in high definition. My granddaughter chose that moment to hit enter on her laptop. The website went live, appearing on everyone's phones simultaneously thanks to a mass text she'd prepared. Modern technology turning everyone into witnesses. Videos, documents, recordings, everything we'd gathered over the past 3 weeks spreading through the crowd like wildfire in drought season. The video of Garrett burning patches alive. The audio of him discussing my murder with the doctor. The financial records show $800,000 in tax fraud. The testimony from his first wife about the attempted murder. All of it spread through the crowd, shared and reshared before Garrett could even process what was happening. But Garrett wasn't done. Even cornered, even exposed, he had one more card to play. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen with desperate speed, and suddenly the main screen behind him changed. Medical records appeared. My medical records, but altered like a photograph edited to tell a different story. They showed a diagnosis of dementia, psychological evaluations that had never happened, prescriptions for antipsychotic medications I'd never taken. He'd been preparing this for weeks, maybe months, creating a false paper trail to have me committed if necessary. The records looked real, would probably fool anyone who didn't know they were fabricated. "You see?" Garrett shouted, his composure finally cracking like ice under weight. "He's insane! They're all lying! This is a setup!" But then the doctor himself walked onto the stage, not proud or confident, but broken like a man walking to his own execution. He took the microphone from Marlena, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The crowd was beyond shocked now, watching like witnesses to a car crash, unable to look away even though they knew it would haunt them. The doctor looked at Garrett, then at me, then at his wife, who stood in the crowd with tears streaming down her face, her expression saying she'd known this was coming. "Every word Marlena said is true," the doctor said, his voice barely above a whisper, but amplified through the speakers like thunder. "Garrett Vernon paid me to kill his father. I infected him deliberately, extended his sedation, created complications that required additional surgeries. Vernon almost died 3 times because of what I did." The confession hung in the air like the pink smoke still drifting past the windows, both of them marking moments that couldn't be taken back. Garrett tried to run, but the marshal already had handcuffs out, the metal clicking with a sound like finality. The IRS agent was on her phone calling for backup, listing charges that seemed to go on forever like a litany of sins. Tax evasion, attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy, witness tampering. The crowd was backing away from the stage now, some still recording, others calling their lawyers. Everyone trying to distance themselves from the man they'd been celebrating minutes before. But the final blow came from my granddaughter. She connected her laptop to the main screen, replacing Garrett's fabricated medical records with real ones. Not mine, but his. The genetic test results from 23 years ago, showing something called an intermediate allele for a disease that had killed his mother. Then current medical records, obtained through Marlena, showing the tremor in Garrett's left hand he'd been hiding for 6 months, the mood swings he'd blamed on stress, the cognitive changes he'd attributed to lack of sleep, all early symptoms of the disease that had taken Helen, the same poison in his blood that had twisted his cruelty into something monstrous. "You have it," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear even without a microphone. "The disease! It's already started, hasn't it?" Garrett looked at me as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, and for the first time in years, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of prison or poverty or disgrace, but fear of the enemy inside his own cells, the genetic time bomb ticking in his DNA. He'd known for months, maybe longer, had felt the changes starting, and had accelerated his plans because of it. The farm sale, the attempt on my life, all of it rushed because he knew his time was running out. The marshal led him away as the crowd dispersed, the party abandoned like a crime scene, which it was. Food and decorations left behind like artifacts of a civilization that had suddenly ended. Pink smoke still lingered in the air, the gender reveal for a baby that would grow up without Garrett's influence, safe from his cruelty and his poisoned genetics. Marlena stood on the stage, one hand on her stomach, crying with what looked like relief. The baby would be born free, would never know the man who'd tried to claim her as his own. I walked outside, needing air that didn't smell like expensive perfume and desperation, needing distance from the destruction we'd orchestrated. The parking lot was chaotic, people leaving as fast as they could, afraid of being associated with the scandal. But I stood still, looking up at the dissipating pink smoke, thinking about prices and payments and justice served cold as a corpse. Everything has a price. Garrett had finally learned his, and the interest would compound for the rest of his shortened life. The news spread through town faster than the pink smoke had dissipated from the sky, carrying on winds of gossip and social media posts that no one could stop. By that evening, Garrett's arrest was on every local channel, his face plastered across screens next to words like fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy. The country club had released a statement distancing themselves from the event, claiming they'd had no knowledge of what was planned, as if crime was contagious and they needed to quarantine themselves. The party planner threatened to sue for damage to her reputation, not understanding that sometimes you get caught in someone else's explosion. Everyone who'd been there was suddenly eager to explain how they'd never really trusted Garrett, how they'd always suspected something was off about him. Historical revision happening in real time. I spent that night in the motel room, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that went bone deep. My brother sat in the chair by the window, keeping watch like he had in Vietnam, though we both knew the danger had passed. The local news played on repeat, each cycle adding new details as reporters dug deeper into the story like archaeologists uncovering a buried city of corruption. They'd found former employees willing to talk, business partners ready to share their suspicions, even college friends who remembered disturbing incidents from 20 years ago. It was like watching a dam break in slow motion, all the secrets Garrett had kept hidden rushing out at once, impossible to stop. My granddaughter called around midnight, her voice hoarse from talking to reporters and lawyers. The website had gotten over 1 million views in 6 hours, she said, and major news outlets were picking up the story. Documentary producers and true crime podcast hosts were circling like vultures, everyone wanting to know how a son could try to murder his father for money, how a successful businessman could hide such darkness behind a perfect facade. She turned them all down, saying the story wasn't hers to sell. But she did give one interview to the local paper, making sure they printed the truth about Patches, about the farm, about everything Garrett had destroyed in his rush to have everything. The next morning brought federal agents to my motel room, polite but thorough in their questions. They needed my testimony for the attempted murder charge, wanted every detail about the surgery and the complications that followed. I told them about waking up confused, about the infection that had nearly killed me, about the doctor's nervous behavior during follow-up appointments. They took notes, recorded everything, built their case piece by piece like assembling a weapon. The agent in charge told me Garrett was facing 40 years minimum, possibly life if all the charges stuck. The attempted murder alone carried 25 years, and that was before the tax evasion and fraud charges that multiplied like cancer cells. The doctor had been arrested too, though his lawyer was already negotiating a plea deal in exchange for testimony. His wife had filed for divorce that same morning, taking their 3 kids and moving in with her father. She'd called me once, briefly, to apologize for her husband's role in everything. I told her it wasn't her fault, that the doctor had made his own choices, but I could hear the guilt in her voice like a weight she'd carry forever. The medical board had already suspended his license pending investigation. His career was over, his family destroyed, all for $50,000 he'd never get to spend. Marlena had been taken to the hospital after the party, the stress triggering early labor concerns. The baby was fine, the doctors assured everyone, but she needed bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. She'd already filed for divorce and a restraining order against Garrett, claiming emotional abuse and financial fraud. Her lawyer, one of the best in the state, was working pro bono, seeing the case as a chance to set precedent. Everything Garrett had put in both their names would go to her, including the house he'd bought with my farm money. She'd already announced plans to sell it and donate half the proceeds to an animal rescue charity in Patch's memory. 3 days after the arrest, I finally visited the farm, or what was left of it. The investment company that had bought it had backed out of the development deal once the news broke, not wanting their brand associated with the scandal. The land sat empty, 20 acres of dirt and memories, legally in limbo, while the courts sorted out the fraudulent sale. My neighbor met me at the property line, bringing coffee and homemade sandwiches like she had in the days after Helen's funeral. We stood where my kitchen used to be, looking at the concrete foundation that outlined a life that no longer existed. She told me the town was rallying, that people wanted to help rebuild what Garrett had destroyed. The local lumberyard had offered materials at cost. Contractors had volunteered their time. Even the high school shop class wanted to help reconstruct the barn. But I wasn't ready for that. Might never be ready. The land was poisoned now, not with chemicals, but with memories of betrayal. Every acre reminded me of what my son had become, what the disease and his own cruelty had twisted him into. Some things, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt the same way. My granddaughter arrived while we were talking, driving a rental car because she'd sold hers to pay for the lawyer who'd helped prepare the evidence. She looked older than 19, aged by what she'd witnessed and what she'd had to do. But there was peace in her eyes, too. The kind that comes from finally being believed after years of knowing the truth alone. She'd been visiting her mother, she said, helping her process everything that had happened. They were rebuilding their relationship slowly, carefully, the way you'd restore a painting that had been damaged, but not destroyed. We walked to the spot where Patches had died, the scorched earth still visible despite 3 weeks of spring rain. My granddaughter had brought flowers, white roses that looked almost luminescent against the blackened soil. She told me about the last time she'd seen Patches, 2 months before the burning, how the cat had still recognized her after 3 years away. Even with 3 legs and failing eyesight, Patches had purred when my granddaughter picked her up, had settled into her lap like no time had passed. That visit was why she'd been at the farm the night of the burning, hoping to see Patches one more time before my surgery. The sound of a car approaching made us all turn. It was a transport van from the county jail, the kind used for supervised visits. My stomach clenched, thinking Garrett had somehow arranged bail, but it was actually his court-appointed lawyer with paperwork. Garrett wanted to see me, the lawyer explained, had something important to tell me before the trial. The prosecutor had approved a supervised meeting if I agreed. My granddaughter immediately said no, that it was manipulation, another attempt at control. But I needed to see him, needed to look him in the eye, knowing he could no longer hurt me. The meeting was arranged for that afternoon at the county courthouse, in a secure room with cameras and guards. Garrett was brought in wearing orange jail clothes that made his skin look yellow, his hands cuffed to a chain around his waist. He'd lost weight in just 3 days, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken like a skull. But it was the tremor in his left hand that drew my attention, more pronounced now, impossible to hide. The disease was accelerating, probably triggered by the stress of his arrest. He had maybe 5 years before the serious symptoms started, 10 before he'd need constant care, 15 if he was lucky before the end. "I know what you did," he said without preamble, his voice different, raspier, like something in his throat was already failing. "The whole thing. Everyone is working together against me." I didn't respond, just watched him across the metal table. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in court documents and news reports. He knew we'd destroyed him, and he knew why. The only question was what he wanted now, what final manipulation he thought he could pull. But when he spoke again, it wasn't what I expected. He didn't beg or threaten or try to bargain. Instead, he asked a question that hit harder than any accusation could have. Did Mom know? About what I'd become? The question hung between us like Helen's ghost had entered the room. I thought about her journal, about the words she'd written as the disease ate her mind. She'd known, had seen the darkness growing in him, had loved him anyway because that's what mothers do. But she'd also protected my granddaughter, had left her money and jewelry, had made sure someone would survive Garrett's cruelty intact. I could have lied, could have told him Helen never suspected, could have given him that one comfort, but he'd burned my cat alive. He'd tried to murder me. He deserved the truth. She knew, I said simply. She knew exactly what you were. His face crumpled then, the mask finally breaking completely. He didn't cry, men like Garrett never learned how, but something in his eyes died. The mother he'd claimed to love, whose memory he'd used as a weapon, had seen through him just like everyone else eventually did. He started to speak, stopped, started again, Finally, he managed to ask if there was anything of hers I'd saved, any message or letter meant for him. I thought of Helen's journal, still in my motel room, full of observations about his cruelty and her guilt over enabling it. He could never see that. It would destroy whatever humanity he had left. "She left you her wedding ring," I lied. "The kindest thing I'd done for him in years. Said you should have it when you get married." The ring was actually in my granddaughter's possession, part of the jewelry Helen had left her. But Garrett would never know that, he nodded, accepting this small fiction, probably the only comfort he'd have in the decades of imprisonment ahead. The guard indicated our time was up, and they prepared to take him back to his cell. As he stood, the chains clanking like Jacob Marley's ghost, he looked at me one last time, not with hatred or anger, but with something almost like understanding. He knew what he'd done, and what it had cost him. The disease might have amplified his cruelty, but the choices had been his. Back in the motel that evening, I sat with the box of Helen's things, pulling out photos from before everything went wrong. Garrett at 5, helping Helen plant tomatoes, his smile genuine and unguarded. At 10, proudly showing off a school science project about heredity, not knowing what inheritance really meant. At 15, the last photo where his smile looked genuine, before the mask became permanent. After that, every picture showed those cold eyes, that calculated expression, the face of someone who'd decided other people were just resources to be exploited. My brother knocked on my door around sunset, bringing Chinese takeout and a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving since 1973. We ate in silence. Two old men who'd survived different wars, but understood loss the same way. He'd heard from his contacts that Garrett's assets were being seized, that the IRS had found even more hidden money, nearly $2 million in total. It would all go to penalties and restitution, nothing left for lawyers or appeals. Garrett would have a public defender and a prison cell, would watch his body betray him as the disease progressed, would die alone and forgotten, except as a cautionary tale. The next morning, I made a decision. The farm would be sold properly this time, the money going to establish a trust for my granddaughter's education and Marlena's daughter when she was born. I'd keep enough to live simply, maybe rent a small apartment near my brother, somewhere without memories. The rest would go to the animal shelter where I'd gotten patches all those years ago, ensuring other abandoned creatures would find homes. It wasn't rebuilding exactly, but it was moving forward, which was all anyone could do after this kind of destruction. A week later, standing in the courthouse as Garrett was formally charged with 17 separate crimes, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but sadness. Sadness for the son I'd never really had, for the family we'd never really been, for all the what-ifs that would never be answered. The prosecutor read the charges, each one another nail in the coffin of Garrett's life, and I watched my son stand there, trembling slightly, alone. He'd destroyed everything trying to have everything. Now he had nothing except time to think about his choices and a disease that would eventually take even his ability to regret. Everything has a price. Some bills take a lifetime to pay. 1 year later, I stood in the cemetery where Helen was buried, placing fresh flowers on her headstone. Next to it was a small marker I'd added for patches. My 3-legged companion who'd died in flames while I fought for life on an operating table. The November wind cut through my coat, but at 70, I'd learned there was no point rushing toward whatever time remained. My granddaughter met me at the gates, graduation gown over her arm. She'd finished her forensic accounting degree in record time, already hired by a firm specializing in financial elder abuse. The shadows under her eyes had finally faded after a year of therapy and distance from her father's poison. We drove to what used to be my farm, now the Helen Vernon Memorial Animal Sanctuary. Where my house once stood was a veterinary clinic. The barn had become a shelter. My cornfields were now pastures for rescued horses. The scorched earth where Patches died had become a memorial garden. Marlena was there with Rose, her daughter who'd just started walking. The child had the doctor's eyes, but would never know the man who'd tried to claim her. Marlena had rebuilt carefully, working from home, raising Rose alone. We'd become unlikely friends, bonded by survival. The doctor would serve 3 more years, lose his license forever, emerge to find his children unwilling to forgive. Another price paid over time. Garrett's news came through my granddaughter's job connections. He'd been transferred to the medical wing 6 months ago, when the tremors spread to both hands. His speech was slurring. He'd had his first major fall. The prison doctors gave him 3 years before full-time care, 5 at most before the end. He'd sent 1 letter, his shaky handwriting explaining how he'd known about the disease for 2 years before my surgery, how desperation had driven him to secure money before symptoms showed. He hadn't expected prison, where medical care was basic and comfort non-existent. I'd received his letter, but hadn't replied. Some conversations were finished before they began. He'd die watching his body betray him the way he'd betrayed everyone else. No visitors after the first month, just him and his deteriorating cells in a concrete box. The dedication ceremony was brief. Local news called it a feel-good story, but I knew better. This wasn't about feeling good. It was about transformation, about turning poisoned ground into something worth saving. Where Garrett had poured gasoline and lit a match, volunteers now tended flowers. Where violence had lived, kindness grew. As sunset approached, a one-eyed orange tabby found my lap. The staff had named her Hope. Too obvious, but she didn't care. She purred against my chest where the surgical scar still ached on cold days. My brother had died 2 months ago in his sleep, leaving me his truck and a note for protection. He'd understood why I'd had to destroy my own son. Never judged me for it. Everything has a price, I said to the empty garden, Helen's words now mine. The payment for Garrett's betrayal had been complete destruction, but sometimes destruction cleared ground for something better. I picked up the cat, feeling her purr through my damaged chest. Time to stop living in motels and memories. Time to find an apartment that allowed pets, to build whatever family I could from ashes. Garrett would die in prison, but I would die free. Some prices take a lifetime to pay. Others get paid forward through generations until someone says enough. I'd said enough. The young cat settled against me as I drove away in my brother's truck, purring like Patches used to. Like forgiveness might still be possible for those who deserved it. Everything has a price. The bill always comes due, and sometimes, rarely, the payment is worth what it costs. What would you do if the person you trusted most revealed themselves to be your greatest enemy? Would you seek justice through destruction, or would you let them destroy themselves? Please share your thoughts below. And remember, sometimes the greatest revenge is surviving what was meant to destroy you.